Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. Today, we're diving into a book that I swear is going to be one of these ones where people will say, like, give me the best you got. And I honestly think it might be Hotel du Lac by Anita Brookner. Here it is, for those of you who are watching on the YouTube. So this is a book that I read a long time ago, and I absolutely loved it. And honestly, this deep dive was so incredibly gratifying because it turns out that this is one of those books, and there are many of them here at the Foxed Page, that really, really rewards rereading and a little deep reading. I'm going to attempt here to give this as both kind of an introduction, so in the sense of giving you all of the things that you might look for as you are reading, kind of like a pre-reading guide. And for those of you who have already read it, honestly, I'm hoping that this will just really give you a chance to just revisit the absolute genius of this work while also deepening your appreciation and your understanding for what an incredible literary feat this is. I always like to begin these lectures with this question of why would I ask you to read this book? Why am I spending this time talking about this book? And I'll tell you why. It's because I was lucky enough to head to Switzerland not too long ago. I am, according to 23andMe, I am 34% Swiss, which is actually kind of a lot. And I have my grandma Vosberg to thank for that. I think she also was part of the reason she and my great-great-grandmother on the other side, who was a Sanskrit scholar, these great grandmothers are people who I think perhaps gave me my lifelong interest in foreign language. We're not supposed to say foreign language, in world language. So I was very, very happy to head back to Switzerland for the first time since I was 11. And this trip did not disappoint. It was end of April. It snowed so hard. It was absolutely the winter wonderland that I wasn't fully expecting, but I absolutely loved. I had reread this novel in preparation for the trip and also in preparation for essentially what is beginning to look like the summer season, and really wanted to have a book that's a very sophisticated and slight, it's not too long, and really rich read for someone who is traveling this summer and wants something that is really evocative of place and is really just like a beautiful meditation on the experience of being in a hotel and the experience of being in a place that is a little unsettling and a little bit different from our normal lives. And this absolutely fit the bill. It's also just absolutely delightful. It is so smart. It is so funny. It is just there is not a single misstep in the entire thing. Those of you who are on the YouTube, and I would encourage you to check out the YouTube if you have not. Not only do you have certain settings like this one here, where I am literally trying to have everything be veal colored. You also will find lots and lots of images that I sort of feather throughout to give you not only a sense of like what these authors look like, but also some kind of pretty like orthogonal views of maybe, what Switzerland looked like or what a funicular looks like. Where we were staying in Switzerland, my husband and I, there was, in fact, a funicular. And I kept thinking I should go check it out. But you know what I did instead? I sat in front of a window and read. I'm 54 years old. I've gotten very comfortable with the way that I have chosen to travel. So those of you who have already read Hotel du Lac know that, in fact, when our narrator checks into the Hotel du Lac, her entire room is veal colored. The drapes, the walls, the bedspread, everything is veal colored. And we're about to talk about Anita Brookner and the fact that she was an art historian, but she is clearly someone for whom textures and colors and setting are incredibly important. And so I needed to give myself a whole veal colored setting here. For those of you who like an agenda, here it is. We'll talk very briefly about the biography of Anita Brookner. Then we will dive in. We'll talk about the cover art. We will talk about the title, the dedication, the opening of the novel. Then we will talk about narrative voice, we're going to talk about tension. So this is a story where, in this kind of, it's almost a novella, but in this relatively short novel, both like a lot happens and also kind of not a lot happens. And for a book where that is the case, there is an incredible amount of tension, and it's subtle, certainly, but Anita Brookner does such a good job of building this tension and really helping us invest in, these people and their plights, and it really keeps us turning the pages. We're going to talk about language. We're going to talk about the prose. Her descriptions, her physical descriptions are incredible, a little off kilter. The word choice is unusual and just absolutely so revealing and so well done. We're also going to talk about figurative language under this umbrella of language. We are then going to talk about some themes. And those of you who have listened to the Foxed Page for a while know that I am not someone who reads for plot, and I am definitely not someone who reads for themes. There's kind of an old saw in writing and in literature, and I really think it's true, that whenever someone sits down to write something, sort of an exploration of a theme, it's pretty much always doomed. So these are themes that have kind of arisen out of Hotel du Lac in a way that I found really beautifully organic and really some sort of haunting, really interesting, rich themes, but in a way that does not at all feel heavy-handed. It's an absolute masterclass in how to develop theme without it feeling like you are developing theme. We're also going to talk about her humor. I found this book so funny, and it's my favorite kind of humor because it's very witty and very subtle and very cutting in some ways. And the last thing we're going to talk about is her evolution, which is kind of like this message. It's kind of the broader message of the book in some ways. And I really loved the fact that it didn't feel like a book that was like going to come up with a message. And in fact, I think it comes up with a very important message so that the ending of the book, the close of the novel, ends up feeling incredibly satisfying. So in terms of biography, Anita Brookner, keep in mind, too, this is all coming straight from Wikipedia. She was born in 1928. Her dad was an immigrant from Poland. His last name was Brookner, spelled in the German way. And the mother, in fact, decided that it needed to be changed because of anti-German sentiment during the Second World War. Her mother was also an immigrant from Poland, and her father was working in the factory, and that's how her parents met. Apparently, her mother, who is in fact very much like the mother, I think, in Hotel du Lac, her mother had a very thriving singing career. I mean, I'm not entirely sure how thriving, but, a somewhat robust career that she gave up when she got married and had a child, and I think was very bitter about that and was a very unhappy woman throughout most of her life. Anita Brookner talks about being unhappy and being lonely as a child. She was an only child, although she did find solace, much like the character in the book, in the fact that an uncle and her grandmother lived in the house with them, and that was, in fact, very helpful for her. In a Paris Review interview, she said at one point, "I have said that I am one of the loneliest women in London," which is really tragic and sad. And this book is a real meditation on being alone and a meditation on choosing to be alone instead of being in relationships that are not satisfying. She never married. She didn't have children. She talked about having lots of proposals of marriage, which I think is interesting, but turned them down and had this sense. There's an amazing quote about how, she could see a mile away that men wanted to kind of chop off parts of her and fit her in a box, and she was absolutely not interested in that. She's someone who had an incredible academic career. She became an art historian. She specialized, I think, in 18th century French art. She taught at Cambridge, and then she was given at Cambridge, she was given this Slade professorship. She was the first woman, in fact, to hold this professorship. And then she went on to teach at the Courtauld, which is one of these really prestigious and really very robust colleges of art history in London. At 53, she published her first novel and then essentially published a novel a year. In 1984, I think it's 84, might be 83, she won the Booker Prize for Hotel du Lac. So I've read several of her novels. This is definitely my favorite, but she is so, so good. There's a little overlap in them, but you honestly never mind the overlap because it is so incredibly well done that you're just happy to be in her, in her world again. She died in 2016. She was 87 years old, died in London. Okay, so now we are going to dive into the book itself. I'm really enjoying how much this cover art is just really doing some great things with my background here. I like everything about this cover, although I will say that I did find another copy that I liked maybe even a little more. This one's a little more somber. It really evokes that walk that at one point our narrator takes, and really is noticing the pattern of the leaves and the falling of the leaves, and the fact that this story takes place in the autumn, and it's a very autumnal kind of moment. I also really love the title. I think the title is excellent. So we have this idea of this hotel as really being central. And the hotel, I mean, in some ways, this is a very atmospheric novel, which I feel like a lot of summer reading, we really choose to read things that are very atmospheric. They're things that will either transport us, to a different realm, or will help us really appreciate the realm into which we are traveling, if in fact we're traveling. If you're doing some armchair traveling, then that kind of atmospheric novel is all the more important. An atmospheric novel simply being one where setting and ambiance is very important, where the atmosphere is in fact very important. But this idea of the hotel is really a very important controlling idea. It really wouldn't work unless they were all together in this space of the hotel. We're going to talk about liminal spaces in a minute. They're simply spaces where change is occurring. So it's a symbolic notion in literature where if you have characters and they're standing in a doorway or in a hallway or a breezeway or an airport terminal or a bus station or a hotel, these are places where change is occurring because there is flux. These are places that are transitory, people are passing through them, and they're often a place where a lot of transformation will occur. And in fact, we have a lot of transformation on the part of this narrator. So I like the emphasis on the hotel, certainly. I also really like the idea of this being in French. There's a certain kind of dislocation here. I think most of us would gather that this is the lake hotel, the hotel of the lake, but it's unsettling a tiny bit because in fact it is not in English. I also like the Hotel du Lac, which is how you would pronounce it in French. You have that idea of a lock. So this idea of being locked in, this idea of being locked into a certain circumstance. Also the idea of a lock, like a boat lock where you're rising and lowering mechanically, like sort of artificially, given the water levels. So obviously it's not spelled like that, but you have that kind of resonance of the idea of locks. It's also incredibly important that our attention is really focused here on the lake itself. So the lake, which we cannot see in the beginning, and in which, several very important things happen. So this emphasis at the very beginning of the lake and the hotel together is masterful. I also really like the simplicity of it. It could be sort of any hotel on any lake. And in fact, we don't know exactly, I don't think we know. Wow, that's sloppy of me. I don't think we know exactly which town that they are in, but that's a beautiful thing because, in fact, it could be any lake town in Switzerland. And we do have this sense of like generic hotels on generic lakes so that each of us can really project ourselves into the text. It's absolutely masterful. We are now going to dive into the beginning of the text here. From the window, all that could be seen was a receding area of gray. It was to be supposed that beyond the gray garden, which seemed to sprout nothing but the stiffish leaves of some unfamiliar plant, lay the vast gray lake, spreading like an anesthetic towards the invisible further shore, and beyond that, in imagination only, yet verified by the brochure, the peak of the Dent d'Auche, on which snow might already be slightly and silently falling. So this is the perfect example of a time when if you really slow down and take a look at the very first opening sentences of a novel, it will really enrich your reading of it. So from the window. So we already have this idea at the very beginning. We don't really have a person. We have someone who is, clearly looking out the window, but we don't know if this person is a man or a woman. We don't know their name. We know very little about them, which is perfect because throughout the course of the novel, the narrator herself is in fact going to gain a much better sense of who she is. We also have this idea of looking out the window, which is an important notion because she's separated. She's cut off from the lake. She's not out in nature. There's sort of an artificial divide between herself and the rest of the world. And there's a certain longing in looking out of windows. There's a certain sense of being, sort of stalled. There's a sense of waiting. That's literally like the first three words. And there's already a lot to say. All that could be seen was a receding area of gray. So gray, much like veal colored, is extremely important. So we have gray throughout the entire novel. It comes up again and again and again. Gray is very important, partially because it is not black or white. This is a woman who has entered into this kind of gray zone, and things are feeling out of control. Gray is kind of this liminal color in the sense that things are not clear to her, and she is needing to sort of exist and kind of thrash around in this gray zone in order to figure out what she's going to do next, and in fact who she is. So then we have this idea, it was to be supposed, there's lots of passive voice in the beginning here. All that could be seen was a receding area of gray. It was to be supposed. So all of this passive voice, I mean, I think almost everyone listening to this has heard that, that tip that you should always use the active voice and not the passive voice. This is a very purposeful thing on the part of Brookner because, in fact, this person is sort of absent. We really don't have a sense of who this person is. So the verbs are not going to be active because this person is forced to be passive. That this is someone who is sort of in exile, slightly self-exile, but also kind of exile. And she has come, to spend a month in this hotel to do some sort of penance. So you have this idea of passiveness, which fits perfectly with her circumstance. And then we have Anita Brookner introduce this idea of the garden. And the garden is extremely important throughout the entire novel. It was to be supposed that beyond the gray garden, which seemed to sprout nothing but the stiffish leaves of some unfamiliar plant, lay the vast gray lake. So the lake is gray, the garden is gray. I was kind of haunted by this idea of this gray, stiffish plant that is growing in the garden. You have this sense of things as being dead, and of, it's the fall, so things are definitely, dying, but it's also a time that we associate with lots of color, with the leaves turning. But this idea of the gray garden, you have a sense of things almost being, washed out and foggy and unclear and eerie and sort of dead in a way that is very purposeful and very important here. So whenever you come across a garden in anything you are reading, take a moment and take a look at the garden, and if the writer is worth her salt, you will be rewarded by like a symbolic manifestation of something important. Oftentimes the garden will reflect what's happening with the person who owns it or the family. I've mentioned this before. If it's weed choked, that's one thing. If it's super orderly, it's another. If it's very productive, if it's gray and it has one stiffish plant that's unfamiliar, that is telling us a huge amount about the fact that this narrator is a little alienated. She is in, she doesn't know this plant. The plant is gray. The normal things that we would look for in a garden, growth and abundance, or even, leaves falling and things, sort of dying, none of that's even happening. It's just gray. And the reference to gray gardens is something that I should have looked at. That's that movie with those two women, but I did not, in fact, look that up. That's something you're going to have to take care of yourself. So we have the gray garden, and beyond that, the gray lake. And then we have the first of these kind of interesting, unique, off-kilter references. She says, lay the vast gray lake spreading like an anesthetic towards the invisible further shore. So spreading like an anesthetic is so great. So you have this idea of her as being anesthetized. She can't see things, she can't feel things, but it's such a great comparison. In fact, this is a simile because it has like or as. So the lake and all the grayness in the garden are like an anesthetic. So she is, in fact, at the beginning here, somewhat anesthetized, our narrator. We then have the idea of this peak that is far away that she can't see, which is the dent d'Auche. So Auche, O-C-H-E, in French can mean a good pasture. It's also, importantly, I had to look all this up, a line when you throw your darts. The Auche is the line that I don't know how you, Auche, the och, is the line that you would stand behind in order to throw darts. So you have this idea here of a game being played. You have this idea of a somewhat dangerous game. You have an idea of chance and somewhat of skill and of, hitting bullseyes. So there is a slight evocation here, not for me personally, but if you, in fact, were an English person who played a lot of darts. Then, of course, we have the idea of the fact that snow might be falling, slightly and silently falling. So she uses adverbs so incredibly well. Adverbs, as I have said many a time on the Fox page, are really, they tend to be lazy, they tend to not be great, but Anita Brookner is so, so good at them. I like this one, slightly and silently falling. I like how they're almost the same. In fact, the first time I read it, I kind of tripped over them because they actually look very much the same. But you have this combination of sibilants, which is those S sounds, together with the liquid L's, the slightly and silently falling. It's almost that kind of hissing noise that you get when you have snowfall. That sounds weird, but I think you know what I mean. So you have this idea of the sound of snow as being evoked here. And so you have the idea of snow silently, I can't even say it. Snow slightly and silently falling. So you have this evocation of winter coming. Winter is coming. It's actually not at all Game of Thrones here, but winter is in fact coming. And then we have her stating that, for it was late September, out of season, the tourists had gone, the rates were reduced, and there were few inducements for visitors in this small town at the water's edge. And then it goes on from there. I'm noting as I am reading this out loud that these sentences are very long, which is noteworthy because in fact, Anita Brookner is very sophisticated. She's very good at grammar. And these sentences are really pulling us along. They're pulling us right into the story. Our narrator here is Edith Hope, is in fact a writer. She is someone who has really good command of literature and command of the English language. It's hard to stop because there are very few full stops as we are moving along. The idea of late September is also important because we realize that she is not coming for vacation. And in fact, on the next page, we find out that this is this kind of exile that she and her small community of friends have decided is the best idea for this, this sort of sin that she has committed. And at the bottom of the very first page, we have this inclusion of the idea of the apple. So we have this. On the cheerful uplands to the south, a rising backdrop of apple trees, the fruit sparkling with emblematic significance. So I love this. Anytime you come across an apple when you are reading, especially if it's in a setting that seems very utopian and kind of like Eden, if it's an Edenic setting, you need to think of the Garden of Eden and you need to think of that apple as representative of knowledge, and you need to think of Adam and Eve and the fact that they eat from the fruit of knowledge. And importantly, when they eat from the fruit of knowledge, what it is that they are understanding, the knowledge that is conferred upon them, is that they are naked and that they have, committed this cardinal sin, and they will be cast out of the Garden of Eden. So I also love that Anita Brookner is also describing this fruit as having emblematic significance. So again, this is a very sophisticated text. It's a book that has tons of figurative language. There's lots and lots of symbolism throughout. And the way that she is cluing us in by giving this signpost that literally says these apples have emblematic significance is, again, alerting us to the fact that if we are paying attention, things like gardens and apples and, the line behind which you stand to play darts, all of these things are important symbols. Some of them more obvious than others, but we need to be paying attention to these things because, in fact, they have emblematic significance. So I find that also to be part of the kind of humor and cleverness throughout the entire novel. She's doing this cool thing where she's kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit, and part of that is because Edith Hope, who is our narrator, is a writer. So there's a lot of sort of meta stuff about the process of writing that is really, really compelling, and one of those things is, in fact, that she is sort of giving us these softballs and acknowledging that talking about this emblematic fruit, and this is perfect for a woman who we are about to find out is a fallen woman. Okay. On the second page here, we're still in the very beginning of the book, but we have learned so much already. And we have this. Edith Hope, a writer of romantic fiction under a more thrusting name, remained standing at the window, as if an access of goodwill could pierce the mysterious opacity with which she had been presented. So I love this. Edith Hope is her real name. And then here we have this idea. She's a writer of romantic fiction under a more thrusting name. This is that off-kilter, incredible description. The idea of a romantic writer having a thrusting name, it's very much like a Danielle Steele kind of moment, or like Judith Krantz. I guess that's kind of thrusting. I don't know who today is writing romance, but back when I was interested in romance, when I was a sophomore in high school, it was all Danielle Steele. But then we realize she's someone who writes romantic novels, and there is quite a bit in here about what her novels are meant to do. It's very clear. There are two different descriptions of what her novels are meant to do, and a lot of it has to do with how women are supposed to behave, which of course is a central question throughout the entire novel. So then she starts talking, in fact, about this kind of exile and this climate that she has gotten herself into. So it is this climate in which she could be counted upon to retrieve her serious and hardworking personality and to forget the unfortunate lapse which had led to this brief exile in this apparently unpopulated place at this slowly darkening time of the year when she should have been at home. But it was home, or rather home, which had been inimical all at once, so that she had acquiesced, rather frightened at what was happening to her, when her friends had suggested a short break. So she has this lapse. Importantly, the lapse is also a word for the fact that Eve eats from the tree of knowledge. So there's this idea of pre-lapsarian, which is like all of the Edenic stuff that happens before Eve has her lapse. So you also have the idea, of course, of a lapsed Catholic. You have all of these ideas of lapses. I love it as a word. And it really, again, we have this mystery that is right here on the second page that is presented to us, this lapse. And in fact, it's not a minor thing. I mean, she has allowed herself to be exiled. And it's, again, at this like darkening time of year, I mean, there's a lot that's actually very foreboding at the beginning here. And then this idea of home that had become inimical all at once. So inimical, it's like it became unsettling to her and sort of like not familiar. I hope that's the right definition of inimical. If not, I'm going to put that up on the YouTube. But let's just hope that I got the gist at least. But it's very grave, in fact, that her home became inimical to her, became alien to her, because in fact, her home is very important. And the home, again, this is another one of these symbols where if you have a house or a home in literature, you should take a close look at whether or not that home is reflecting the family or the person who lives in it. And in fact, her home is the place where she writes. It's a place of refuge for her, as is her garden back at her house. But I loved how subtle and how tense this was at the beginning, because we don't know what the lapse is yet, and we don't know which friends they are who have driven her to the airport and have sort of insisted on this exile. So there's a lot of intrigue that is built up at the very beginning, and in the midst of lots of sort of foreboding symbolism and setting that I found so gripping. So those of you who are Fox Page listeners know that I really love a deep dive into the narrative voice of a certain novel. And this one is so good. So we have this third person narrator simply saying that, he did this and she did that. The kind of narrator that says things like Edith Hope, a writer of romantic fiction under a more thrusting name. That's a narrator that's pulled pretty far back and is omniscient. It knows, in fact, that Edith, knows her first and last name. It knows that she's had this lapse. So we have this kind of distance between this third person narrator and Edith and everyone else in the novel. But then we have this beautiful thing where occasionally the narrator will dip into the first person in order to talk, more from the heart of each one of these people. So oftentimes when we are talking about Edith herself, it's kind of couched in this like she thought, which I actually found worked very well. Sometimes that can be kind of clumsy, but right on the second page of the novel, we have this very telling and very important and sort of upfront description that is very helpful. She says this: "For I am not allowed to be my lapse, as if I were an artless girl," she thought, "and why should I be? I am a serious woman who should know better, and am judged by my friends to be past the age of indiscretion. Several people have remarked upon my physical resemblance to Virginia Woolf. I am a householder, a ratepayer, a good plain cook, and a deliverer of typescripts well before the deadline. So this is so interesting to me because one of the main themes of the book is her resemblance to Virginia Woolf, which we are going to get to. But I love how that's kind of thrown in there. It doesn't really have to do with the idea of her being a very dependable person. I think Virginia Woolf, as someone who's read many of her manuscripts, Virginia Woolf was a lot of things, but I'm not sure she was super dependable. So we have this idea of this likeness with Virginia Woolf. This is that kind of uncanny and somewhat sort of interesting and funny. It's like we have this description that's like coming out of nowhere, but is so apt and is also a little bit funny. But so it's this idea of indiscretion. She has committed an indiscretion. There's this question of whether or not she is an artless girl. And she's thinking to herself, no, I am an accomplished woman. So we have this description here that is in the first person, but it's maintaining the third person because it has this sort of she thought. And it's, I think, very, very well done. But then we have these other excellent little parts where we're dipping into the words and the language and the thoughts of different people. So we have on page 22, we have our narrator treating us to the thoughts of Monsieur Huber, who is the proprietor of the hotel. So on page 22, at the desk, Monsieur Huber the elder, retired but still active, benevolent and only mildly intrusive, was enjoying his favorite moment of the day. He opened the register to see who had gone and who had arrived. Business was, of course, very slack at this time of year. The place was bound to be half empty in the month before the winter closure. That curious elder couple from the Channel Islands had left after tea. So we have this idea, it's very subtle, but we are in fact entering into his frame of mind. It's still in the third person. We're still talking about, he thought this and he had this impression, but we are having subtle language here that is very much what he would have thoughted. This idea here, that curious elderly couple from the Channel Islands, the curious elderly couple, we get the sense that is very much his impression and in fact maybe even his words. We have this amazing description on page 27 of our friend Edith's editor, Harold, and it's an important description because in fact it's giving us another perspective on Edith herself. So on page 27 we have this. She really does look remarkably Bloomsburyan, thought Harold, viewing the hollowed cheeks and the pursed lips. So one of the things, she's always wearing this long cardigan. And in fact, the gentleman who becomes very interested in her, Philip Villeneuve, is that right? I think, no, Neville. Oh, I thought of Villeneuve because that's like new town, when Neville is also like a new town. So Philip Newtown, Philip Neville is in fact interested in her. And he's always like, why are you wearing that crazy cardigan? Which is in fact another signal to us that we are meant to think of her as being Virginia Woolf-ian. In this case, we have Harold, who their interaction is so funny to me and so deft. The dialogue in this book is unbelievably great. But this idea of she does really look remarkably Bloomsburyan, and then the hollowed cheeks and the pursed lips is giving us a sense of what she looks like from the outside, which is important because she, we don't get a lot of that from our narrator. Okay, so there are other characters too whose interiority we are treated to by the narrator. David, who is her lover. At one point, the narrator says this line, he thought of her little house. So you have this idea, again, of like he was thinking this and he was thinking that. So we are very plainly being treated. I keep saying being treated to, which it does feel like a treat because we have this omniscient third person narrator who's getting very close to these people in a way that's very orderly and still at a certain remove because you're saying, he thought this and he thought that. It's not suddenly that we are actually inside David's mind. We also have Philip Neville. We have some of his thoughts. And we even have thoughts from people like Terry, who is the gardener of Edith, and of people like Alan, who is one of the sort of busboy, helper guys at the hotel, at the Hotel du Lac. One of the other ways that Anita Brookner is allowing us to get inside the thoughts of Edith is with these letters that she is writing. I want to read one of these examples because, in fact, it's such an incredible way for us to hear the voice of Edith Hope. So this is when she is writing a letter to David, and it's unclear whether or not she's going to send it. This is this man who she had this kind of affair with. I'm not going to tell you what the lapse was. That is something you will have to find when you are diving into the book yourself. But I will tell you, it is not maybe what you think it is. So she's talking about a dinner the night before with all of the people who are staying at the hotel, which is not very many, again, because remember, it's the end of the season. Perhaps the champagne was making me feel tired. Perhaps I was tired already. But suddenly I had the uncanny feeling that this was all for show, that everything was a pretense, that this had been a dinner of masks, that no one was ever going to tell the truth again. Which is so important. I mean, this is a book that has everything to do with lies and deception and truth and telling truth and using your voice. So, this is right at sort of midpoint of the novel, a little further than midpoint. And it's a very important statement that she is making in her own voice because, in fact, we have this letter from her. Then she goes on. I wanted you then, David, very much, but you were not there. Only Mr. Neville was there, enjoying himself hugely. There's an example of these adverbs that she uses so well. So enjoying himself hugely says everything about this Mr. Neville and the fact that, like, in the midst of this kind of champagne-fueled farce, that he is in fact enjoying himself hugely. Mr. Neville, I should explain, is a connoisseur of the fantastic, an intellectual voluptuary of the highest order. This gives you a sense, too, of the language that Edith Hope is using. We know she's a romance writer, but the word choice that she selects when she is writing these letters gives us this sense of her intellect and of her command of the English language, which is so excellent. I mean, the idea of an intellectual voluptuary, that is the most incredible description. I mean, it really is pulling together this idea of voluptuousness and this idea of intellect in this way that is so telling and also just so sort of strange and interesting. I love it. Also, he's not just an intellectual voluptuary, he is an intellectual voluptuary of the highest order. He's also a connoisseur of the fantastic. I don't even really know what that means, but it's so great. So when we make these sorts of observations, like the idea of the narrative stance here, it's important to look at that and then ask ourselves, so what? Why is it that Brookner is using this? Because everything is so deliberate in this novel that absolutely she's taking great care with her narrative voice. That isn't to say that she sat down and was like, I'm going to write this novel with this third-person narrator that's going to dip into these characters. But in fact, there would have been some organic process. And what I would argue is that the first person that we are hearing, this voice of Edith's, which we see in the letters and we see it occasionally in the beginning and sort of throughout the whole entire novel at different points, it becomes more and more clear, partially because we are hearing it and we are having her, reactions to different things. So we're getting to know her as the novel is going along. But my sense is that we are hearing more and more in this first person toward the end of the novel. And in fact, the very close of the novel is told from this first person. So I would argue that one of the things that Brookner is doing so well here is that we are getting to know Edith in the same way that Edith is getting to know herself. We as the reader are having this experience of her sort of coming out of this gray anesthetic fog and into focus at the same time that she herself is, which is in fact going to allow her to make a really good choice when it comes to having to make a decision at the end of the novel. I want to move on to talk about the tension a little bit. So on page 117, which is well into the novel, it's a little bit further than halfway through, we have the end of a chapter, which is so good, and it really, really ratcheted up the tension for me. It's a very short paragraph at the end of a chapter, and it says this: Sitting alone in the silence, she bowed her head and passed scrupulously in review the events that had brought her out of season to the Hotel du Lac. It's so good because we're like, oh my God, we're finally going to hear about what this big lapse is. And in fact, I'm not going to read you the next sentence, but I will tell you I have many, many exclamation marks by it. It is a real doozy of a sentence that comes next. So this idea of ratcheting up the tension is also so great because, in fact, it is very satisfying when the tension is, sort of dispelled, when, in fact, we are treated to this sort of reality of her lapse, or how she feels about David, or how she feels about Mr. Neville. One of the things that was so interesting to me is I would have these kind of stabs of like, what is going to happen? And I wanted to do like a little test and see why it was in these certain circumstances that all of a sudden I was like, wait, how is this all going to be resolved? And I didn't actually do that, but I think it's very interesting to take a look at the times when suddenly I would just be reading along, reveling in this incredible prose, and then I would be like, oh my God, but wait, what is going to happen? I think it's because I felt so invested, but I was like, what is going to happen? And one of them here is on page 124. I'm not going to give you any context or background because I don't want to spoil it if you haven't read the book yet. But if you have read it, you will remember what is happening. The sound of a key in the lock had made her start. Her irregular cleaning lady, Mrs. Dempster, pink-cheeked, brilliantly coiffed, generously sober, looked at her with amazement. Not dressed yet? She marveled. So this is such an incredible piece. I mean, part of why I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen is because we are realizing that she is not dressed and she is not ready to face this thing that she is about to face. So I love the idea, her irregular cleaning lady. So that is repeated from before. So the first time we hear about Mrs. Dempster, she is also described as irregular. So, I mean, your irregular cleaning lady could simply mean, that she comes irregularly, but we know, in fact, that she does, in fact, come regularly, and she is shared between our Edith and another woman who lives nearby, her friend. But the irregular cleaning lady says everything we need to know, which is ironic and interesting in a cleaning lady. I also love that her name is Mrs. Dempster, which of course sounds just like dumpster. And in fact, she's not a very effective cleaning lady in lots of ways. She's gossipy and she's judgy and she's not particularly good at her job, but she is a real character. And then this description, which is so incredible. Pink-cheeked, brilliantly coiffed, generously sober. So I mentioned before, in fact, that Anita Brookner is amazing with adverbs, and this is such a good example. Brilliantly coiffed. I mean, it's really evoking for us this crazy hairdo that the housekeeper has, and then this idea of generously sober. It's so quirky and funny, and I think it's so smart. The insinuation, of course, is that Mrs. Dempster is often drunk, and in this case, she is generously sober. It's like she's really, doing her employer a solid here by showing up at this big event sober. So, and then we have this idea, not dressed yet, she marveled. So anytime you have attribution of a quotation, the rule for any sort of good writer is that it just should be said. It should always just be, she said, he said, they said. You really want to avoid things like replied or, exclaimed. All of those things end up feeling really clunky and take the reader out of the dialogue. But in this case, this idea, not dressed yet, she marveled. There's a certain sort of marveling that is happening here. It just says everything about Mrs. Dempster and also about the moment. Also, I love the fact that she's saying not dressed yet. It's not that like you haven't dressed yet or you are not dressed yet or you're not dressed yet. The fragmentation there speaks to her surprise, but it also speaks to the incredible ear with which Anita Brookner writes dialogue. She's amazing. So we have this description, which is unbelievably great, but I am interested in the fact that, yes, like the fact that she's not ready for this thing is a big deal, but I was so taken by this like, oh my God, wait, what is going to happen? It's so effective, subtle, but also just absolutely amazing. So I have one other example, and again, this does not spoil anything, but it speaks to the symbolism in the book and the idea of the lake and the gray lake, and then the way that is transformed. So the very best symbols in any novel, the only time they should be repeated is if there is some sort of alteration. And we see this unbelievable, sort of re-emergence of these symbols. The garden, whether that's the gray garden at the Hotel du Lac or whether it's her garden at her home, which is a very very important place. A lot is happening in that small garden at her house. But we have this idea here of the lake, and we have this. On the opposite shore, she could make out lights that seemed almost welcoming now, the lights of the Hotel du Lac. So I love this. This is another example of a time when Anita Brookner is just stating something for us. She's stating it very clearly. The lights of the hotel look almost welcoming. Of course, it's very important that they look almost welcoming, and it's that they look almost welcoming now. I hope I'm reading that correctly. Yes, that seemed almost welcoming now. I mean, the qualifiers there are incredible. They seemed almost welcoming. I mean, there's a lot of hesitation. We don't know, in fact, if they are, I'm answering my question here. My question was like, why was I like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And maybe part of that is because this is this very tentative idea that in fact the hotel will be welcoming and that her problems will be resolved. So the tension for me was really ratcheted up there in a very, very subtle way, obviously, but one that I found so effective and so deft. I want to move on to talk about Brookner's unbelievably masterful use of language. So we have this one description here on page 88. Edith, in her veal-colored room in the Hotel du Lac, sat with her hands in her lap, wondering what she was doing there. So this idea of sitting with her hands in her lap is so telling. This idea of just everything being sort of gray and imprecise and just kind of not inspirational really, really fits well with this idea of sitting with her hands in her lap. It's a description that is simple, but absolutely speaks volumes. So a little later in the novel, we have another incredible example of word choice. Edith, together with our third-person narrator, really says something that is very substantive, and she says it in very plain terms. She says this on page 149. Women share their sadness, thought Edith. Their joy they like to show off to one another. Victory, triumph over the odds, calls for an audience. And that air of bustle and exigence sometimes affected by the sexually loquacious. That is for the benefit of other women. No solidarity, then. So she's lamenting this lack of solidarity. But what really stood out, in addition to this idea of just like a very sad sense of women as not, banding together very well, is this idea of the sexually loquacious. So loquacious is just someone who talks a lot. So sexually loquacious is this incredibly erudite and interesting and sort of off-kilter way to describe someone who's very flirtatious and very, but there's like a certain kind of language emphasis there that is so interesting to me, and that, again, speaks volumes about Edith. There's also this incredible part where Brookner is using adverbs in a way that is signaling to us that the language is not doing what it is supposed to be doing. There's a lot in this book about deceit, and there's a lot in this about sort of saying one thing and meaning another. And so we have these two lines that Edith says, and we have these very important adverbs there. You are sadistic, she said pleasantly. Again, I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to spoil who she's talking about, but saying to someone, you are sadistic pleasantly, or she said pleasantly, you have this idea that being sadistic is something that she values on some level, that boldness and the idea of really taking someone to task. And then later we have this, I hate you, she shouted hopefully. So again, we have this idea of someone where the language isn't quite matching with what is happening. And as the reader, you know that, but there's a certain humor and a certain levity, but also a really important message that is being sort of colored in more fully by the use of these adverbs that seem very contrary, but in fact are crucial. We're going to move on now and talk about figurative language. Figurative language is simply language that is doing more than simply what it says. Think of a metaphor or a simile or symbolism or any kind of foreshadowing. All of those things you learned back in high school English. So one of the ideas, we're just going to kind of mention them because there is so much to say here. We don't have time to really dig in. So as you are reading, pay attention to all of these liminal spaces. Of course, we have the idea of a hotel, which is by definition liminal because people are sort of moving in and out. It's in flux. A lot of transformation may or may not be happening. There's the idea of the boat as they are crossing the lake. That's another liminal space because it is one of transportation. Like literally, they're being transported in more than one way, and not just literally. We have the idea of the salon, which is where the guests gather. And that's a very interesting one because it's not a private space. It's not their own bedrooms, but it's also not a completely public space. It's within the confines of the hotel. And they all sort of let down their guard. There's a lot of dialogue and a lot of sort of action, again, subtle action, is happening in this salon, which is another liminal space. There are a lot of hallways. Very important things are happening in the hallways of the hotel. So whenever you see a space like that, a doorway, a hallway, lots of doorways too, think to yourself, what kind of transformation is either happening or not happening here? We've talked a little bit about the grayness of the whole thing, but this idea of gray throughout as being not black or white is very important. We have the idea of the gardens. We spoke a little bit about that, but it's very important to think a little bit further about the garden that is Edith's at her own home. So she has a gardener, Terry, who is alarmingly pale, which is another excellent use of an adverb, and it really, again, tells us everything we need to know about Terry. But you have this idea, and Terry's one of the few people in the novel who's like really dependable and consistent, which is kind of ironic because he has such a small role in her life. But you have this idea of her garden. It's not something that she tends. It's something that is being tended by someone else. So again, you have a certain kind of absence in her presence, even in her own garden. It's also a garden that is at the front of her house, which is important because she has a lot of people going by, and there's gates. There are lots and lots of descriptions of the people going by the garden, and a lot happens in the garden that is important because it is this liminal space. It's somewhat private, but it is also public because it is on view of the entire neighborhood. We also have this idea that there's a little girl who comes from next door, and she's this breathtakingly beautiful, or heartbreakingly beautiful young girl, but she has this speech impediment. And there's this beautiful scene where every night, our Edith is able to sort of calm this child and send this child off to sleep simply by being present in her garden. But you have this sense of the garden, again, as not being a place that is only Edith's. In fact, it's this place where people are able to come and go. We also have the idea of the garden as being like it's somewhat wild. The things that are growing there are wild. We have dirt, we have plants, we have weeds, we have, well, not too many weeds because of Terry, but we have this idea of a wild space, but it is also one that is somewhat domesticated. It's one that is being sort of kept under control, again, by Terry. So you have this space that is neither public nor private. It's neither domestic nor wild. So you have this very sort of, it's a very interesting space. And importantly, she says that the only time that the garden is actually hers is early in the morning or in the evening. So again, you have this idea of this domestic space, her house and her garden, as not quite working for her, which is hugely important. And, you can read these passages about the garden and not think, about all these different levels on which you can read it. And it's beautiful prose, and, you can focus on just what is happening there and this beautiful interaction with this little girl every evening. And you can get plenty out of it, but I think you'll get a little more if you dig a little further. So there's also the idea of her house. It's always her little house. And there is this idea of her maybe outgrowing it, which is just an interesting, sort of tension throughout the whole entire thing. There are different times when the house feels empty. There are times when the house feels like an incredible sanctuary. So the different ways in which her house is functioning have everything to do with how she herself is feeling in her life. Importantly, she receives a marriage proposal from someone who has a very fine house. And in fact, it's a very fine example of Regency Gothic, which just killed me. So this is the kind of humor that we have. So Regency is this period, think Bridgerton, think Belgravia. It's in the beginning of the 19th century when the king was insane, and so his son was appointed regent. So you have this idea of the Regency era, but it also, in fact, is Gothic. So the idea of Gothic things, you have to think Jane Eyre, you think a long, long time ago, you think Frankenstein, this idea of death, this idea of drama, this idea of, thunderstorms and ghosts and hauntings. So it's so funny to me because it's this strange combination of the two. And it's also a very fine example of this Regency Gothic. So it's this idea of this sham and this idea that he is offering her something, that's all sort of trumped up in this. Well, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to say. But, you have this idea of something that's this creation and this example of something else that's out of time, but that is also very desired. And she really has to weigh whether or not that's the kind of life she wants. It's so beautiful because it doesn't seem heavy-handed. But when he is offering her the house, that is the life that he is offering to her. And as an astute reader, you'll really have a better sense of his proposal if, in fact, you have a sense of what this house is all about. There's so much stuff about weather in here. The weather is so important, and they're actually very clear statements about the weather and how, weather can be very metaphorical. There's something called pathetic fallacy, which is when weather, in fact, is reflecting the state of the person or the characters in the book. So, all of this fog, and then, when things are brilliant, and then when the leaves are falling and the trees are lifeless, all of these, sort of weather things are, in fact, reflecting the states of our characters. We also have a lot of symbolism with her hair. And this is something, again, that might have seemed a little heavy-handed. There are very important points in the novel where her hair is all pinned up and then she lets it go and it's flying free. So it's a very important symbol to look at. You should always, if a woman is letting down her hair, that's just like an expression that we all have. But this idea of her pinning up her hair or letting her hair go or putting her hair back up, all of that is very important. I found so subtle and so important this idea. A couple of different times she talks about brushing her hair the way she was taught. So that is very important because, in fact, you're like, wait, who taught her? Because her mother is, in fact, very checked out and is not a great mom. So you're like, was it her grandmother who taught her? Like, we just don't know. And that idea of, it's so subtle, but this idea of brushing her hair the way she was taught, it's not, the way my grandmother taught me. We have this vacuum. We don't know, in fact, who is guiding this young girl. We don't know who was was influencing this young child. It's such a beautiful and such a subtle way to reveal the real loneliness and the real lack of any kind of maternal presence. The parts where she is a child are just absolutely heartbreaking. And there are lots of them. There are a lot of evocations of her mother and father that are always tense. Her father has died when she is a young person, and it's a very sad loss for her. Although there is a very important refrain that she comes back to again and again, that is her father's, words, her father's language that is resonating for her. But you have this idea of her childhood as being very lonely. Children in general are extremely important. So Edith Hope is childless. Also, Anita Brookner is childless, which I don't want to read too much into that. I don't know if she wanted children or didn't want children. Again, she was very successful academically, so it may have been something that she just simply didn't desire. But we have a lot of ambivalence on the part of a couple of characters in the book. Ambivalence in the sense that they both want children and don't want children. And the beautiful thing throughout the entire novel is that there are children in all of the really important scenes. So in the crossing of the lake, the boat has a whole classroom of children that are on it. And at some different points, there are groups of children who are passing by Edith's garden. But children are also absent at the hotel itself. So we have both the presence and absence of children that are incredibly well done and really something that you should pay attention to. So that is a very good segue into this idea of these themes, and we're going to touch on them only very briefly here. So there is a lot about mothers and daughters throughout the entire thing. Importantly, in the novel, the name of the sisters, there are 3 sisters, I believe, or at least, yes, there's Rosa, or 2 sisters, Rosa and Anna, and there's Großmama, which is her grandmother. So these are German women. Their last name is Schaffner. These are these Schaffner girls. And their last name means bailiff. So you have this idea of her as being sort of held against her will, whereas we understand that her father's name, although he isn't mentioned like that, but his last name would have been Hope because her name is Edith Hope. So you have this idea of the sisters, the 2 sisters and the grandmother as being sort of divorced from our Edith. And it's we're going to take a look at the names in just a minute, but you have this idea that she's also named for her grandmother. So you have this like matrilineal thing happening, but it has skipped a generation. And in fact, Rosa, her mother, is not, in fact, a great mom by any stretch. So you have a lot of conflict and a lot of desire and a lot of questions about maternity that resonate both in terms of, wanting to have children, but also in terms of reflecting upon her mother. That whole theme is so rich. We also have a lot of comparison with the mother and the father. We've touched on that a little bit. But you have this idea of the maternal and the paternal as being really very decisive and very split. And in lots of ways, you have this sense that she is trying to decide if she's going to sort of align more with her mother or align more with her father. There are a bunch of different examples where they're bringing up psychoanalysis. So at one point they're talking about the latency period. They don't say latency period, but they talk about latency. And this book is in 1985, so there would have been like a long-standing tradition of Freudian psychoanalysis. I don't know how Brookner feels about it, but there definitely is an undercurrent here of an analytic sort of idea, which would really have everything to do with this preoccupation between the ways that the narrator is thinking about her mother and her father. Also, this was one of my very favorite parts of the book. So we have this theme of this Virginia Woolf, resemblance. We have Harold saying she's Bloomsburian, and we have this idea that she seems like Virginia Woolf. Her cardigan, people say she looks like her. So very importantly, the name that she has chosen is Vanessa Wilde. So you have Virginia Woolf, and she's very clear that Vanessa Wilde is sort of an appropriation of Virginia Woolf's name. So I love the resonance too with wild and wolf. A wolf is obviously a wild creature, an undomesticated force. And Virginia and Vanessa, importantly, Vanessa means a butterfly. So you have this idea of transformation. You have this idea of being sort of in the chrysalis and then emerging as something else, which is just beautiful. And then this idea of wild, of her as being something that is undomesticated. So her pen name, this more thrusting name, is Vanessa Wilde. It's actually a very lovely name. I like it very much. But we have all of these resonances between Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Wilde and Edith Hope. And this idea of like, is Edith Hope going to be like Virginia Woolf? So some of the most salient things we know in terms of Virginia Woolf is that she had a very, uncommon relationship and in fact, a very sort of sexless relationship with Leonard. They had a very good marriage in lots of ways, but it was a highly unconventional marriage. And in fact, she had affairs with other women that were very important to her. We also know that she was plagued by mental illness throughout her entire life and that she committed suicide. So this idea of positioning yourself as sort of another Virginia Woolf is, first of all, it's very bold, and I like it. I like the boldness of it. But you're aligning yourself with someone who has real struggles and someone who eventually commits suicide. So there is, I'm not going to tell you how it goes, but this kind of, the parallels are very, very important, and it's something that comes up again and again. So this is this idea of hope versus despair that comes up over and over throughout the novel and really leads to a very satisfying ending. So very quickly before we end, I want to touch on the names. So Anita Brookner, who is just so good at every single element here. Of course, she left no stone unturned, and every single one of the names is incredibly symbolic. So Edith means encompassing the elements. It comes from Old English. It can also mean riches, and it can mean prosperous in strife. So all of this idea of richness and of riches, she is someone who makes her own money. It's very important to her. She's very, capable of sort of, providing for herself. She is encompassing all of the elements, certainly this sense of weather and this sense of grayness and this sense of wanting to live this very rich life. And then also prosperous in strife. There's a lot of strife, and she is taking herself out of it, but she is also attempting to move through it. Hope is her last name, which I think is very straightforward. Then we have Vanessa Wilde, which we just talked about, an undomesticated butterfly. Then we have David. So this is the man that she's in love with and writing letters to and Anita has this affair with earlier on. And beloved and favorite are the definitions of David. So a very apt name for him. Then we have Philip. So Philip means horse loving, which I think is so funny because he is someone, who sort of, comes onto the scene and is a possible suitor for her, when in fact his name means that he is mostly interested in horses. Then we have Penelope, who is one of her good friends, and Penelope is a weaver. When you think of like Ulysses and Penelope, and in fact Penelope is a total gossip. Penelope is getting herself right in the sort of midst of all of these things and is weaving together lots of things. She's the architect behind, this exile that our poor Edith is undergoing. Then we have Schaffner, which of course is bailiff or steward. Steward is probably the nicer way to think about it, but I imagine that we're supposed to think of them as bailiffs. Also shafted, this idea of Schaffner, it's a very German name, obviously. So there is this real sense of force in that word, Rosa Schaffner. Even the very minor characters like the Pusey, maybe you would just say pussy, which is really funny, actually. I think Pusey is probably what you would say. There's the mother and daughter, and that means learned in theology, which is funny because these are totally vapid women who are only interested in, they're not totally vapid. In fact, they're really very tragic in lots of ways, but the only thing they're interested in doing is shopping. So shopping really has very little to do with theology, I think. And Jennifer, who is the younger of them, who actually turns out to be a very important character, means fair and soft, and both of those are very apt descriptions for her. So, and Alan, who is like the like bus boy, is fair or handsome. So you have this idea of every single character, even the very minor characters, as having very symbolic names. Okay, we are not going to finish by looking at the close of the novel, even though I love it so much, but I don't want to spoil anything for anyone. But what I want to do at the very end here is just walk through all of the many, many things that we were not able to cover today. One, again, is this idea of psychoanalysis. There's so many meta parts. So this idea of talking about the process of writing the book is really important. We have a whole feminist strain that we didn't get to look at today. She is a character who is not super comfortable in the company of women and definitely prefers men, which is a very interesting perspective and is really very powerful throughout. We also have there's so much description about bodies and about the corporeal that's really, really interesting. We have a lot of these characters who are sort of twins or foils for one another. In some ways, Edith and Monica are foils for one another. David and Philip are foils for one another. There are lots and lots of pairings that are very interesting to look at. And then, of course, occupations. David is an auctioneer, and Philip is he was an engineer and is also a farmer. So you have all of these different occupations for these people that are very symbolic. So. And that is, these are all things that we haven't had a chance to look at today because I do not have just endless amounts of time to talk to you about this incredible book. But I hope that this is a book that is read a little more widely, maybe, because I do think it is just so excellent. So thank you for tuning in. Happy reading.